Today's reading is from the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. And you can find that on page 179 of your Pew Bible. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Euphrates from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God."
Good morning. Let me start by addressing the elephant in the room. I am not wearing a suit today. And today is not Throwback Sunday. It appears as though I did a terrible job of communicating with you, but on the bright side, some of you look really great today. So we actually have rescheduled, and this had to do with the availability of Terry Sly. We actually rescheduled Throwback Sunday for next week. So next week, Mark, you wear that exact same suit again, okay? And Brian, you too. And this is actually a time where, in 5 years, we're going to celebrate our 100-year anniversary. Can you imagine? That's really cool. So we'll have to start preparations for that. But one of the things that we want to do is we want to honor our heritage. I mean, we don't want to stay stuck in the past, but we want to honor all of the people and the ministry that's gone on before us. And so next week, what Throwback Sunday is basically a Sunday where we do piano and possibly an organ and probably a pulpit if I can find the pulpit. And and you all need to dress up just like Mark is, or Brian, or some of you others. Loretta, I think, was dressed up as well. And we'll have a great time. This is, we'll turn the clock back to 50 years ago, and I think what you'll see is that they worshipped just as well back then as we do today. And so that's what we're going to do next week, all right? So this is good communication now. So hopefully you'll be with us. And actually, you know what? I actually brought some pictures. We've been in preparation for Throwback Sunday. We were actually looking through some of the old pictures that we had, and so I brought a few of them just for you to see. And I think the first one that we have up here is one of when this sanctuary was first built. Do we have it up there? Yeah. When this sanctuary was first built, this must have been like grand opening or something like that, or kind of early on. And look at the place. It was just packed out, really cool. But, the back of the sanctuary is different because that was before this whole big building behind us was built. And, some of those. And that's Millie there in the front, right? George and Millie Walquist. And, So we also have one. They used to have a children's choir. And so there's a picture of the children's choir. I don't know. Any of you in that choir? I don't know what's that? Jeff Kane. Okay, one of our missionaries, Jeff Kane, is a part of that. Is Sani or I don't know if I see him in there. Anyway, okay. There's an Easter worship service. This is a little bit more contemporary there. Okay, you see all the palms and that. And then there's one, and you know what? Loretta must be teaching again today because she was here earlier, and there she was teaching way back when too. So Loretta, and then of course next week we will see this site again with Terry Sly playing the piano just like he did years ago with a few more gray hairs. So and I think maybe let's see, he has his jacket off there, but we'll see. Maybe he'll have his jacket on next week. Anyway, it'll be a great time next week. A couple of other quick notes. I want to remind you of Discovering Waite Park that's coming up. That's our membership class. You don't have to become a member if you take the class. You don't automatically become a member, but if you want to become a member, then you have to take that class, and that will be on March 18th from about 9 to 1. And we would love it if you would just take this. There's a little flap on your bulletin here, an info card, and if you would fill that out and let us know if you would like to be a part of that, that would be awesome. And then we'll plan for you to be there. And then also, we were going to do Ash Wednesday service this past Wednesday, but because of the snowpocalypse, we decided to push it back. And so it actually won't be an Ash Wednesday service, but it will be a Lenten service where we'll take communion together. And it'll be, I think, a great time. Hopefully you all are already, kind of well on your way into Lent. But we thought it would still be a good thing for us to have that service of worship and prayer and confession in preparation for Easter. And so that'll be coming up this Wednesday at 7 o'clock. Okay, here's a story that as a good Wesleyan, I probably would not tell at throwback service. I'm not really much of a dancer, and probably because I grew up Wesleyan and we're not known for our great dancing. But I love music and concerts and worship music. I love music a lot, but I've never really been a big dancer. I can appreciate it, but this just was really not for me. But I will tell you, and this is maybe a bit of a confession, is that on Monday, I was at a dance party, participating in a high-energy dance party with Latin dance tunes. And I wasn't at a club or anything like that, and I don't speak Spanish. But yet, there I was, jumping up and down, and I have to admit, I was enjoying myself. I actually, there was a gal there that I lifted and spun her in the air, and it wasn't my wife. And also, I did that with a guy, too. I'm not a dancer, but on Monday, I was doing some things that were pretty out of character for me. Why was I doing something out of character and actually enjoying myself? Well, because of love. You see, the girl that I was lifting and spinning wasn't a random girl. It was my granddaughter, Anna. And the guy, Mateo, you probably guessed it, they do speak Spanish and they do love to dance. And so they were at my house on Monday. We were taking care of them, and we had a dance party. And because they love to dance in certain circumstances, I also love to dance. Now, when I tell that story, I don't think many of you are very surprised, although I did see some looks of horror on your faces as I was telling it. Some of you probably figured it out immediately, because I talk about my grandkids all the time. But the fact is you all could probably come up with some stories about crazy things that people do for love. Keep mice in your freezer, run into a burning building, murdering a new lover's ex, watching football with your spouse. And when you think about stories like that, you understand that love may be the most powerful force in the universe. And in fact, biblically speaking, if God is love, then yes, love is the most powerful force in the universe. But not only is it the most powerful force in the universe, it's also the most powerful force inside of you. You see, it's not logic or willpower that makes us do what we do, it's love. And if you speak to anyone, even in our society that is so bent on accumulation and success and things like that, if you asked anyone in our society today, what's the most important thing in the world, chances are they will probably come up with something that has to do with love. And they would be right about that. In fact, Jesus himself tells us that. The Bible all over tells us that. You know, when religious leaders asked Jesus, what is the most important matter of the law? What did he say? He said this right from Matthew chapter 22. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. And I don't know if you know this, but the Apostle Paul says something very similar in the book of Galatians as well. When some religious leaders were going around and trying to convince new believers that they needed to follow the Jewish law, the Apostle Paul writes this. He told the Galatians, he said, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. The Apostle John, in his letter of 1 John, encourages us, above all, love one another because love comes from God. And in fact, he tells us that God is love. And Jesus, as he was preparing to go for the cross, told his followers, this is my command, that you love one another. But the question is what does it mean for us to love one another? Because you see, people have different ideas about what love actually is, how to define it. For instance, there are some people who say that love is a decision. And we can see this truth when we try to do what Jesus told us to love our enemies. Because none of us feel like loving our enemies, and sometimes we have to do loving things despite the fact that we don't really feel like it, that we would just rather not. And so sometimes it's necessary that we just decide that we are going to treat someone with kindness. But if, like we've said, character is what happens before you've had the chance to think about it, and God loves his enemies, then I think that Jesus' point is that at some point we should get to the place where loving our enemies is just as natural as loving our friends. Sometimes we do need to decide to love people, but the love that Jesus is talking about, I think it actually goes deeper than that. I've also heard Christians say that love is an action, or in the words of DC Talk, love is a verb. And the point is that we can say that we love someone, but if we never raise a finger to help them or show them in tangible ways that we love them, then do we really love them? And in fact, this is also something that John says in his first letter. He writes this. He says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us as an action. And we ought to lay our lives down for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us love not with words or speech, but with actions and truth. But if you look closely here, what you'll see is that John is not saying that love is an action, at least not just an action. He's saying that self-sacrificial actions are evidence of love. But love itself is more than just the actions, because you can do good actions without actually loving people. You can do good things for self-serving reasons. And of course, there are some people who say that love is an emotion. You know, this is where we sometimes equate love with romance. And of course, in my circles and probably in your circles throughout the years, it's been pretty common to dismiss this one without much thought. Because we're mistrustful of our feelings. They sound flaky and selfish, and sometimes they can be. You know, it makes it seem like I love someone because it makes me feel good. But of course, we know that feelings and emotions can be very unreliable, and so love is not an emotion, or at least it's not just an emotion. You see, if that's all there is to love, then what do? Do we just grit our teeth and tough it out and love people anyway? I don't think so. I don't think we're left with just that. But see, what I want you to see, and the reason that I told that story at the beginning, is that I want you to see that love is actually a type of attachment. See, a mother doesn't have to grit her teeth to love her child. She doesn't want to get up in the middle of the night and feed or comfort her child, but she does it. And why does she do that? Because she has a loving attachment to that child, and love is a powerful motivator. Love is a bond that forms between a grandpa and grandkids that will make a grandpa do things that are out of character sometimes. Attachment love is the most powerful force in the universe. And it also just happens to be the type of love that God has for us. This type of love is captured in the Old Testament word Hesed. And rather than having me try to stumble through to try to explain it to you, I'm actually going to allow the Bible Project to do that. And so I brought a video that does a great job of explaining what Hesed is. So why don't you go ahead and roll that video.
If you tried to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently describe God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. We're going to look at this fourth phrase, loyal love. It translates the Hebrew word chesed, which is hard to translate into any language because it combines the ideas of love, generosity, and enduring commitment all into one. Chesed describes an act of promise-keeping loyalty that is motivated by deep personal care. Like in the story of Ruth. Ruth is a foreigner married to an Israelite man, but tragically her husband dies along with his brother and his father. All Ruth has left is her widowed mother-in-law, Naomi, who has nothing to give her. Naomi tells Ruth she should go back to her people, but instead, Ruth promises to stay by Naomi's side and take care of her. And as other people watch Ruth keep this promise over time, they call it an act of chesed. Notice that Ruth's chesed is not conditional or based on Naomi's worth. Rather, it's an expression of Ruth's character. She just is a generous and loving person who keeps her word. That's chesed. Now, Ruth's loyal love is truly inspiring, but the one who shows the most enduring chesed in the Bible is God. Like in the story about Jacob, who is a treacherous liar even to his own family. But despite that, God chooses him and repeats the promise he made to Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, that he would have a huge family through whom God would restore his blessing to the nations. And so 20 years later, when Jacob realizes how undeserving he is, he says to God, "I'm not worthy of all the chesed you've shown me." And he's right. But God's chesed was never about Jacob's worth in the first place. It's a display of God's generous loyalty to his promise. God's chesed continues into the story of Jacob's descendants, the Israelites. When they're enslaved by Pharaoh in Egypt, we're told that God remembered his promise to Abraham and Jacob, so God defeats Egypt and raises up Moses to liberate the people and lead them into the promised land. And in the story, this is called an act of chesed, because it was about God keeping his word. Now, on their way to the promised land, the Israelites are scared of the nations around them, and they doubt that God can protect them. So the people threaten to kill Moses and appoint a new leader to take them back to Egypt. God is understandably hurt and angry, but Moses steps in and says, "Forgive the sin of these people because of your great chesed." Notice that Moses asks God to forgive not because the people deserve it, but because it's consistent with God's own character. And God agrees, and he recommits himself to a people that don't want to be committed to him. In the Bible, God is loyal and loving for no other reason than it's just who God is. Of course, he wants his people to respond with chesed in return, but even when they don't, God's chesed remains. The prophet Hosea compared Israel's chesed to a morning mist that's here one moment and gone the next. But God's chesed is enduring. Like in the celebration of Psalm 136 that opens by saying, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good," and then 26 times repeats, "His chesed is forever." And so, after centuries of Israel betraying their commitment to God, and after humanity's long history of violence and death, God still kept his promise in a dramatic and drastic way by becoming human and binding himself to us in the person of Jesus. And the people who followed Jesus of Nazareth said that in him they encountered the God of Israel, who is full of loyal love and faithfulness. Jesus is the ultimate loyal and loving human. And in his life, death, and resurrection, God opened up a new future for all of us and for all of creation. And God did this because it's just who God is: generous, loving, and eternally loyal to his promises. And when we experience the purity and power of God's loyal love shown through Jesus, it compels us to reimagine why and how we can show Hesed back to God and to the people around us. This is what it means to say that God is overflowing with loyal love.
Well, as you see, the language of Hesed is a language of covenant. But in our individualistic and consumer society, our relationships are oftentimes based on a transaction. Of course, a transaction means that as long as you pay the fee, as long as you hold up your end of the bargain, then I will treat you well. But when you don't, then the deal is off. And this is true sometimes even in churches, unfortunately. See, too often the temptation is for churches to treat the church as a product that we consume rather than a family that cares for us. Some people, when they get bored with the product, then they go ahead and move on. And honestly, the way that many of us do ministry actually lends itself to this too. Create a good product on Sunday mornings and attract people, and then your church will grow. And then when leaders sit down with new people, we convince them to stay by talking about all the great programs that we offer. And of course, I'm not against programs. We need to have programs because we need to have ways to organize ministry. But the truth of the matter is that programs don't transform lives. What does transform lives? Hesed. You see, when we're saved, God doesn't just whisk us away to heaven. He saves us into a community where we become a part of the people of God, and we take on a new family identity. Okay, let me explain it to you this way. I was hoping, he was scheduled today, Walt Skidmore. He was going to play bass today. You've seen him up here many times, and you've seen him play many different instruments. He's played the bass, and I don't know if he's ever played piano here, but actually I hear that's his best instrument. But he's played cajon and drums. He also plays trumpet and ukulele, all kinds of other instruments. And just a really talented guy. Now, I'm sure that he has worked at it, has spent a lot of times practicing the various instruments and that. But Walt also comes from a very musical family. In fact, when I was out in Washington, his son is named Connor, and he just got married this October. And I was out there officiating at the wedding. And rather than having a dance after the wedding, we had this reception, a pizza party that was outside, in this great setting. But rather than having a dance, they just pulled out a bunch of instruments, and we had a jam session. Just everybody grabbed a different thing. You'd finish a song, and everybody would switch, and you would just keep on playing. And that's what it was. And it was an absolute great time. And that session was actually led by his parents. You see, when I talked with Walt afterward, he said, well, this is something that we just always did. It wasn't uncommon growing up for us just to get together as a family and play music. Right? Now, you can be a musician even if you're not from a musical family. But given his family, it would have been really difficult for Walt not to end up being a musician. In a similar way, so many people see counselors to try to undo the impact that their family has had on them, and sometimes they still can't do that. That's the power of family. The goal of a good church is that people who belong to it will have a hard time not being conformed to the image of Christ. Because that's what families do. Right from the very beginning, the most powerful language that the Bible uses, or the Old Testament, for instance, uses, is the language of family, the family of God, brothers and sisters. And here's the point, is that if we want to be attached to Jesus, then we need to be a part of a community of people who are attached to Jesus. If we want to be like Jesus, then we need to be in a community of people who are like Jesus. If we want it to be natural to love our enemies, then we need to be in a community of people who love their enemies. Of course, this is an idea from the New Testament, but it also goes back to the Old Testament. And twice we've read the passage, Bible Project talked about it, the story of Ruth. The video that we played earlier talked about it, and the story of Ruth actually might be the prime example of Hesed in the Old Testament. Naomi was a Jewish woman who moved with her husband and sons to Moab to find food because there was a famine in Judah at the time. Now, the interesting thing about the story is that the Moabites were, I don't know if you would quite call them the enemies of Israel, but at times they were. They actually attacked them and tried to take over their land sometimes. They were pagans. They worshipped many gods. And so, they weren't on great terms necessarily. And yet, the famine was so severe that Naomi and her family moved there to find food. And while they were there, her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, their names, by the way, mean sickness and death. And so maybe one moral of the story is if you want your kids to live a long time, don't name them sickness and death. Right? But while they were there, they married good Moabite girls. And then within 10 years of moving there, both of them, along with their father, Naomi's husband, also died. And that, of course, is bad enough. But, of course, in that society, especially for someone like Naomi, it was even worse than that. Because in that day, women didn't really have a means to be able to care for themselves outside of a relationship with a man, whether a son or a husband. And so here she was in a foreign land, actually in the land of her enemies. And not only that, but she was older, and, frankly, older women were not in high demand to be wives those days. And so she knew that her prospects in Moab were not very good. Now, her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, had much better prospects. They were still young. They could probably find new husbands. And so Naomi decided to head back to Judah to see if she could find some relatives that would take her in, she could live with them. And she encouraged Orpah and Ruth to go back to their families until they could find a proper husband. Now, Orpah takes her up on this, and we sometimes judge her for this. But actually, the book of Ruth doesn't really blame her for this. It's actually kind of a reasonable and natural thing for her to do. But what Ruth does in response is actually the picture of Hesed. You see, she could have gone back, but look at what it says starting in Ruth 1:14. It says, "But Ruth clung to her." Right? It's a powerful image. I mean, you can actually see it happening, giving her a hug and just saying, "No, I am not going to leave you." Okay, she grabbed on and she wouldn't let go. And Naomi, of course, thought this was a little bit crazy, as probably many of us do as well. And this is what goes on in verse 15. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to go back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me." And this is a vow that she takes. "May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. And so they went back to Judah. And now Ruth was a foreigner. She was a Moabite in a Jewish town. But one day she went to gather grain from the field of a relative of Naomi's named Boaz. He's a wealthy man. And they were now a package deal, Ruth and Naomi. And in the end, all of this story ends up with Ruth marrying Boaz, even though he's an older man and she could have found a younger man to marry and be taken care of, but she did it so that Naomi would be taken care of. You see, the way widows were taken care of in that day was to find a kinship redeemer who would buy the property of the deceased person and take responsibility for the widow. And Ruth has said for Naomi caused her to sacrifice for her sake. And in fact, in the video, it mentioned this, that toward the end of the story, Naomi actually says to Ruth, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." And the word that's translated there is the word Hesed. kindness. And as you can see, the word kindness is right in this context, but Hesed is something that actually is much deeper than that even. It doesn't do justice to what it really means. Now, regardless of what you think about the whole system of kinship redeemer and everything that went on in that time, that's how it worked back then. And the point is this, is that this is a picture of Hesed. It's the picture of God's Hesed for us, but also the model for us to follow. And what you find out there is that Hesed creates family. And this is where in our world today people start to get a little bit uncomfortable, especially when we start talking about the church this way. Because sacrificing what you want for the needs of others is just not emotionally healthy. Right? I mean, what about what Ruth wants? How could she be her authentic self if she married Boaz? And so it seems strange to people like us in our day. But there's also something else that seems strange about having a church that talks about having Hesed relationships. See, some people would say, well, that sounds kind of cultish, actually. Isn't this what cults do? They even might use the language of family to keep people as a part of their group. Well, I mean, they do that for sure, but that's not what we're talking about. But the reason that such a close-knit church seems strange to us is because it's not the kind of community that our society fosters. We're individuals first, and then maybe we're part of a group. Okay? And I hate to do this, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why things are cults and what is actually a healthy Hesed community. Okay, so let me just mention 5 things here. First, what you find in cults is that the leader is an absolute authority. Okay, he demands loyalty to himself, not to Jesus. Other people aren't allowed to question him or the other leaders. They're manipulative and they demand unreasonable loyalty to themselves. Right? Now, I want to assure you, I don't have any desire to be your absolute authority. I mean, I hope that when I'm preaching that you listen to me and, kind of trust what I say and all of that, but you all are always free to disagree with me on various things as well. I'd be pretty bad as an authoritarian. Okay? I want your allegiance to be to Jesus and not to me. And I hope that we facilitate that and get out of your way. Leadership, oftentimes in a cult, operates in secret, and we want to be very transparent with you. Second characteristic of a cult is that in a cult there's no room for disagreement. Okay, now we are a church that believes something specific. Okay, we do have certain core beliefs. They're in the historic creeds, and they're there for everyone to be able to read for centuries and even millenniums. And we also have some secondary doctrines that we teach. But if you disagree with them, then we can talk about that, and there's probably a good chance that you can still be a part of our community. In fact, belief that it's virtually impossible for someone to believe every single thing, every single point of doctrine of any given denomination. We talk about this in membership class all the time. Now, we hope that you align, we hope that you respect the beliefs of that denomination, but there are probably some things that you might disagree with a little bit, and that's okay. We do have basic beliefs, but there is room for you to be able to ask questions. Third, cults demand exclusive devotion. Okay, many times they demand that you cut yourself off from outside relationships, right? Friends or family. If they're not a part of the group, they ask you to not associate with them. Okay, but we highly encourage you guys to be involved in other things, to have friends outside of the church, to have friends at work, and to do things like that. We don't need your exclusive loyalty. Cults also have beliefs that diverge from historic Christian teaching. Okay? And there's often a pride with that attitude that we are the only ones who get this right. Okay? That all Christians throughout history have had these basic beliefs, but now Jesus is lucky to have us because we finally got things right. Okay? We hope that we got things right, but man, I'm very open to the fact that maybe there are some things that we don't. And finally, cults utilize shame to keep people in line, and it shuns people who leave. But a community of Hesed is a community of grace, not of shame. Now, we want you to be free of that, and we want you to experience the life of Jesus. And when you do, there are tensions that you have to hold. Tensions between devotion and freedom, between accountability and grace. And that's the kind of environment where people actually grow the best, where people are committed to each other and we have healthy relationships, where people are transformed into the image of Christ just by being a part of the community. And when that's the case, then teaching like this is actually kind of a supplement to growth, but the bulk of it is done simply by being in relationships that live out and model what it means to think like Jesus and act like Jesus and even to feel like Jesus. And there's no way to practice this by yourself. So we're doing this series called Soul Training. And oftentimes when we talk about soul training, it's an individual thing where you sit alone with God and you do these things. But it's hard to practice Hesed relationship when you're doing it just by yourself. And so we're going to practice a couple of things this week that have to do with building Hesed relationships. And I want to warn you, it's not going to happen in a week. Okay, what this does is it's just, and this is true, I think, for all of our disciplines, is it's trying to set in your life patterns that will, over time, that will form you into the image of Christ, that will form you into people who are more capable of loving Jesus and loving your neighbors and even loving your enemies. And so, one of the things that we're going to do, we're actually going to do right now in this service, all right? And it's something that we practice quite often, and sometimes we might tie it to this, but it's what we call doing care cards, all right? So in your bulletin, you have a card just like this. And if you're a visitor, if you're a guest with us today, you don't have to participate in this because it's going to be very difficult for you, all right? But if you're someone who's a regular part of the church, then this is a care card. And the reason that we do this is because oftentimes we forget about various people. And this is a great way for you to set aside some time to express love or care or gratitude or appreciation to someone else within the church community. Now, I know that some of you maybe don't have bulletins, or if you're a couple, you took one bulletin. We have some extra care cards. So if you don't have a care card, I want you to raise your hand, and Holly is going to come, and she's going to pass out care cards for you to fill out. And what we're going to do is we're just going to give you a couple of minutes. We're going to turn on the writing music. We're going to give you a couple of minutes then to think about someone within the congregation that you want to send a note of gratitude, or you haven't seen in a while. You say, hey, we miss you. I was thinking about you. I've been praying for you, or something like that. And on the one side, you can write your note to them. On the other side, just put their name on it, and we will address it and stamp it for you. And then when you're done with it, when you're walking out of the sanctuary today, you can just put it in the offering box, or there's actually a care card box on the connection station in the back, all right? And this is the reason that we do this is because we want to build love and appreciation. We want to build Hesed for each other. All right, so we're going to take a couple of minutes here. Go ahead and cue the music when it's done, then we'll move on, and I'll tell you about the other thing we're going to practice. Need a little more time to finish that up. You can go ahead and take that now, or at the end of the service, once it's done, then you can finish it up there as well. But this is, an opportunity, and I hope that when we do it in service, that you take that opportunity and you fill out those cards and send them to someone. But I also hope that it's something that you do on a regular basis, just a call or an email or a text or coffee or something like that, connecting with someone else just to make sure that they know that they are loved as a part of the community. Now, here's what we're going to do this week as a practice. And again, this is a communal practice. This is something that we do together. If you can't get this together this week, then try to do it over the next couple of weeks, okay? But what we want you to do is we just want you to eat with someone, right? Seems pretty difficult, doesn't it? And in fact, I know many of you are in small groups, and if you are in a small group, we would like you just to eat with your small group. If you don't already do that, then you're going to have some planning to do. Maybe the host can cook, or you can do it potluck style or something like that. You can work that out for yourself. Or if you're not a part of a small group, then like small groups, you can invite other people into that. Or if you're not a part of a small group and you just want to get together with someone else, just schedule a meal with someone and get together. But while you're doing it, don't just eat together, but also recognize and acknowledge that where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there he is in your midst, right? That when you are eating together, Jesus is actually with you. And so as you get ready to eat, rather than just saying a perfunctory prayer or something like that, take some time and express gratitude to God, okay? Not just for the food, but maybe just go around the circle and talk about what you're thankful for. Acknowledge the fact that when you are gathered together, that God is present with you. Acknowledge God's attachment, his Hesed love for you. And again, this is not intended to be just a one-time deal. It's intended to be something where we cultivate, where you guys are just continually doing this together, getting together with each other and developing these kinds of relationships. And many times doing it in the form of a meal is the best thing that we can do. Okay, so we're asking you to do that either this week or next week, sometime in the next couple of weeks. Do that and be very intentional about acknowledging the presence of Jesus with you when you do it. All right, so that's a pretty simple practice for this week, right? And of course, you can continue on if you're doing examine, if you're doing gratitude prayers, continue to do those by yourself as well. We want to develop those patterns of expressing gratitude and appreciation and experiencing joy through that. But we would love for you to spend the time eating with someone with the presence of Jesus there with you, right? All right. This is the kind of community that we want to be. We want to be a community of people who are loyal to each other, who live with a deep sense of gratitude to God, who are able to recognize God's covenant love for us. And because of that, to experience a deep sense of joy. But it's not something that I can make happen through sermons, okay? It's not going to happen just because you know about it now. It starts with experiencing joy and gratitude in God's presence. And from there, it means you're intentional about connecting with each other and recognizing that where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he is there in your midst. But it also needs to be a community where we build connections across generations. Okay, this is another thing that we do. We oftentimes have a tendency to silo ourselves off. And so, man, if your meal can be multi-generational, that would be awesome too. And that's the kind of a community that we want to facilitate, where older people are both teaching and learning from younger people, and younger people are learning and have respect for their elders. And there's a friendship that's developed where a younger person can be in a congregation and see the faithful older generation and see what it's like to live a life of faithfulness to Christ throughout the years. And then they can talk about it, and they can say, oh, this is what has been really difficult for me. This is where I've been able to find joy. This is what I've done in that situation. Okay, a community of Hesed, a family, is by definition multi-generational. And we don't want to just have a community where we have old people and young people all present, but where we are together, where we know each other and we love each other. As the Apostle Paul writes in Romans 12:10, be devoted to one another in love. And that's the kind of community that we want. I know that it's a bit countercultural, but this is how people are transformed. And this is how people who are not currently a part of our community will actually experience the goodness of God as well. And this is how we'll pass faith down to the future generations. And whether you're married or unmarried, whether you have kids, empty nesters, never had kids, whatever your situation in life, you have a part to play in this. And you are a part of this community. And we will continue next week with this conversation and talk about how to have these kinds of healthy relationships in a church. Lord, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for the people who are gathered here today. And man, it's such a big challenge in our society. It's such a big challenge for us to live in ways that are so countercultural, that we actually connect with one another, that we actually identify with this group of people before we even identify as individuals, that we're willing to sacrifice for the sake of others. But God, I pray for our church community here. I pray that we would not be a transactional community, but that we would be a community of Hesed, of attachment love, where we are willing to make decisions to treat each other with kindness, that we feel the emotions of love and all of that. But mostly, God, that we would be developing this attachment to one another that deepens our love for you, that deepens our love for each other, and spurs us on toward Christ-likeness. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.